Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
It's what I call, for a lot of people, a two-hand goal. If your training is one ball and your relationship is another and your job's a third, you can realistically kind of only hold two at once. So I think a lot of people, when they commit to an Ironman, don't realize that you're committing to kind of like, not only are you going to have to hold this ball, but you're probably going to have to hold it with two hands. And if you're not mentally prepared for that, I think it can have a major impact on your overall happiness. And then sometimes people don't realize that they actually can't fit it in or they don't want to.
Welcome to the Afternoon Snack Podcast. We have a very, very special guest on today, Rach McBride. I have to say, I was nervous just messaging them to get them on the podcast. And when they messaged back with a hell yes, I was over the moon. They've been racing as a full-time professional triathlete since 2011, started at the ripe old age of 32, which isn't very common. They're a 5-time Ironman 70.3 champion and have numerous podium and course record results across several distances in the sport. They have logged 10 Ironman 70.3 fastest bike splits and are a 2-time Ironman bike course record holder. We also know them from Unbound, where they are a 2-time winner of the non-binary division. Rach is the first professional triathlete to be out as a gender non-binary. They also are smart. They hold 2 graduate degrees in genetics and are an accomplished cellist, having toured the US and performed in Europe with various bands. Unfortunately, today we didn't get to talk about that stuff, but don't worry, we're going to have them back on the show. Rach also loves being a minimalist, spinning fire, and working in sexual health education and advocacy. Once again, we didn't get an opportunity to talk to them about that, but like I said, they are for sure coming back on the show. I ask a lot of questions, self-serving for my half Ironman, and then we talk about what it means to be non-binary in the sport and inclusivity in sports in general. So, hope you enjoy this. We sure did. Hey, Rach, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We are very excited to have you. I was a little nervous about asking you, but I just sent the message on my own. Didn't even ask Meredith and just said, I sent Rach a message to see if they'll come on the podcast. And here you are. So thanks so much.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, no worries. I was excited for you all to reach out.
Awesome. So you just got back from Mexico, Cozumel, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
You did an Ironman race there. How did that go?
It was kind of the same experience as I have had in my previous iterations of racing in Cozumel, plus my past 4 years of racing Ironman, which is like the swim is great, the bike is decent, and then the run something happens on the run in the latter half, and it just goes terribly wrong. So yeah, it's a bit frustrating, but I'm getting used to it at this point.
So what went wrong on this run?
This run, it really is that about halfway through, I start having GI issues. So I'm running from porta potty to porta potty. And then by the last 5K or so of the run, it feels like I become really incoherent and really wobbly and weird. And it's just like I am using every ounce of mental and physical strength I have to get to the finish line.
Yeah, Ironman's a kind of an interesting modality in race because you really are getting into unknown with that run specifically, because you can't really train that. You train the swim, you train the bike, you train the run, you do some bricks, but you're not doing something that's even touching on that duration or intensity. So there's all this preparation and probably guesswork on your end to see if you can create a better situation. And you have to do the race to test it out.
Exactly. You can't race that many Ironmans in a year, right? The max I have done is 5, and that was nuts in a calendar year. You're never training a marathon. You're never running a marathon in training. You can practice your nutrition till the cows come home. Practice and practice and practice and training. Things can go totally perfectly, and then you end up on race day and it's a completely different scenario. I think that's what has intrigued me about Ironman so much, is trying to put all those puzzle pieces together. It's almost like it's luck. when it happened, when you have like a good race.
Yeah. And you have to wonder, the people who are like top athletes, is it luck, or is there just something about them physiologically that allows them to endure things, like specifically like the nutrition side of it? Like, do they just have iron guts and they can manage the intensity and not have to worry about food bouncing in the second half of that marathon? And is that what makes them so good at Ironman? Like, there's all these factors that kind of create the path for athletes, and that's the case in all sports, but you really have to wonder that with Ironman specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that we're learning so much more about the body and about endurance athletics, it's like there's so many different factors to look into. It's like, what about your like gut microbiome? Like, what about what is going to be irritating in your gut and not? Different temperatures. I think for me, like if the swim is in salt water, I think I have problems later on in the race versus like a freshwater swim.
Yeah, that's all like so interesting.
To back up, an Ironman distance is, you're in Canada too. So in kilometers, it's 3.8 kilometer swim.
Yeah, 2.4 mile and then 112 mile bike or 180 kilometers. And then a marathon, which is 26.2 or 42.6.
And that's going to take you about 10 hours for the top.
Well, it really depends on the race now. In the women's race, sometimes they are going well under 9 hours. My fastest is 9:06. So it's taking somewhere between like 8.5 and 9.5 hours for the top athletes.
Yeah. So that's a significant amount of time at like a high effort.
It's a work day.
Yeah, it is a work day. It's so crazy to think about. And it's really fascinating in the experience. Like it doesn't feel like that long because you're like in the moment and you have 3 different sports that you're doing. And so, yeah, time is a very weird thing in Ironman.
Yeah. I've always wondered that. Like the swim, it makes sense because time's a weird thing in the water. I've only ever done really short ones like Olympic. So I've always wondered when it gets to that distance, are you even aware of the time and the clock other than, maybe a watch that you have going? Or is it, I guess like you said, you're present and in the moment. So it just goes by.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is just really segmented totally. So it does just feel like, 5 hours on the bike is like, in the end, like you really want to get off your bike. Like you don't want to be on the bike anymore, but it doesn't feel like 5 hours. It doesn't feel like you've been on the bike for 5 hours. So that's the funny thing that like any of these races I've done, I cross the finish line and I'm like, did I actually just like run a marathon after doing all of that? That's insane.
You're like, I shorted that course, right? Like I did a turn early. No, yeah, that's so cool. It just speaks volumes to what human beings are actually capable of doing if you can kind of get out of your own way.
It's funny, even in training, because I'm more familiar with running. And if you do a race pace run, maybe it's 10K at a marathon pace. For me, I'm like, how on earth did I run this for 42K? It's amazing what race day can bring out. So,
right. Yeah. Plus you're like tapered into it. So like you don't have all the cumulative training fatigue in there and you don't realize like what a difference that makes until you get to race day and you get out there and you're like, oh, wow, doesn't feel hard at all. And that's like, that was the cool thing too about, in the past couple of my Ironmans coming off the bike and starting the run. And I'm like, I feel like I'm just like jogging and I'm looking at my watch and I'm like, I'm running how fast? Like I'm trying to run slow. I'm not running slow enough.
That's funny. You're like, I guess I'm really fit. Anyways.
So I guess I'm curious. You've been doing triathlons for 14 or 15 years, I read.
Yeah, it's my 14th season. Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome. I guess just tell us kind of how you got into it and then how you progress in distance, if at all, or if you were just one of those people that was like, I'm doing an Ironman.
Oh gosh, no, I was definitely not one of those people. I thought when I first started triathlon, I thought Ironman was insane. I thought those people were crazy. I started out with a sprint distance race. I'm like an adult onset athlete in that I quit all sports when I was like 15 years old and didn't do anything for about a decade. And then I was really out of shape and wanted to do something cool, epic. I'm like, I'm going to run a marathon. So I trained for this marathon and ended up qualifying for Boston in my first marathon, which I was like, okay, that's cool. I guess I'm kind of good at this. And then ran Boston. I got really into the running scene and the community that I was in. And one of my running mentors was like, I think you could be an elite triathlete. And I'm like, I've never done a triathlon before. But yeah, that sounds like fun. I'm going to do that. And I moved out here to Vancouver. Yeah. And like trained really hard and took it really seriously. Did my first sprint distance here, a local one, and like almost won it. It was second place. I just remember like coming out of the swim and onto the bike and just like had this massive grin on my face. And I'm like, this is so cool. I love this. And I'm really competitive and I like things that I'm doing, things that I'm good at. I just kept going. And the first Olympic distance race I did was a couple months later, and it was amateur national championships, which I ended up winning my age group there. And then the next year I was amateur world champion. I just kind of skyrocketed in terms of my success in racing short distance and moved into like kind of the bottom rung of Olympic stream here in Canada. But I got burnt out quite quickly. I didn't know how to balance things. I was really good at filling every single moment of my day with stuff. Plus, I was like still working a full-time job. And at that point, it was an expensive hobby. I was like getting injured all the time and was like, I can't do this. I'm going to retire from triathlon. So I actually took about a year and a half off and just raced bikes for that time. I had done another graduate degree during that time as well. And when I graduated, my coach was like, you should try this long distance triathlon stuff. And so my first triathlon in 2006, and that was 2011. I did my first half distance race and I crushed it. I ended up winning by like 24 minutes and like posted a time that would have put me top 10 at like 70.3 world championships that year. My first 70.3 was a month later and I ended up on the podium in that race, overall podium. So I was like, okay, I'm not getting any younger. I was 32 at the time. And I'm like, I'm going to jump in with both feet and see what I can do. And that was 14 years ago. In terms of like moving, then graduating up to full distance racing, because I had so many running injuries, like the first 5 or 6 years of my career, I had stress fractures almost every year. I wasn't able to get the run volume that I needed for a full distance Ironman, even though I was really interested in it. And so it wasn't until 2016, so like 5 years into my career, that I was able to do my first Ironman.
What would be like an ideal amount of run volume while training for an Ironman?
I mean, for me specifically, I think that it would be like somewhere around 5 to 6 hours a week of run training. It really depends on the person though. If someone comes from like a really elite running background, they don't need a whole lot of run training. They've already got like so much in their body that they really don't need to train that all that much. But I think that with Ironman, there's so much that you can do by getting really fit on the bike so that when you come off, you're just a lot more rested and a lot stronger. And I think there's a lot of alternative training that you can do, like more strength-based training, or I've done a lot of vertical trail work, almost like stair running. That's been really helpful to offset what I consider lower volume of run training that my body's able to handle.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm doing a 70.3 next week on Sunday. And I've been doing research, but I did have some questions about it. But I also have just general questions about triathlon. And then we have some questions, since you're such a great bike rider. I actually saw you at Unbound. Meredith pointed you out. I didn't look into how good you were. And then I realized how good you were when we did RPI and we barely made the cutoff. I mean, we were taking our time at aid stations. I'm saying that, but I really needed that time at the aid stations. And you did it in like just under 5 hours, I think. And so that was like one of those things where you actually calibrate like, oh, okay, yeah, they're really good. So we'll ask you some questions about that as well. But I guess some general stuff, what would you say are the two, and this can be like a very open-ended question, whether it's like mindset or training-based or nutrition-based, but what are two things that you've learned over your years as a triathlete?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, for me, one of the biggest things that I have learned is having the courage to recover, having the courage to like take it easy and to not overdo it. I would much rather show up at a start line 10% underdone than 1% overdone. And I say courage because I think it takes courage to, at least for myself and the type of athlete that I am the type that needs to be reined in versus motivated. And so it feels like, oh, I'm not doing enough. I'm never doing enough. I need to keep going and going and going. But that's how I break myself. That's a huge thing that I have learned, is how to balance things, how to listen to my body a little bit more, how to be like, I'm feeling this like little niggle here today. Maybe I shouldn't do this like track workout that I am supposed to do, but like do something easier, or like go see my PT. And then I think the other thing is also in the mindset sense is that in order to be a successful athlete, and especially over the long term, it is more about consistency than like just continuing to like PR and continuing to like smash every workout. You can get really hung up if you're looking at your numbers, like your paces or your power numbers on the bike or your swim pace times, and being like, oh, I'm not making any progress, or like, oh, I was a lot slower today, I must be losing fitness. But having a good sense of the overall picture of just continuing to show up, to put in the effort that you have, to put, like, it's like if you've got 60% in the day, you put in 100% of 60%, to not get hung up on one specific workout or just like really super smashing every single workout, that it's more about just like continuing to just do the same thing over and over and be really consistent. And that's going to help with longevity in the sport. Like, you'll be really surprised at how well you're able to race with that kind of mindset as well.
Yeah, I think it's common for beginners, but also for more, I guess we don't work with a ton of elite athletes, but even amateur athletes, they can get really caught up in, and I take myself too in this, where you assess what your results are based on one training day. So if you have like a bad lifting day or a day where you're supposed to hit a certain pace on the run and you don't, you make a conclusion about how you're getting worse. But that's only one day. It's difficult to get your brain out of that and just kind of let it go. So that's a really good piece of advice. And then on your first piece of advice, it was interesting because sometimes people think of discipline as this thing that gets us, to the pool or out for a run, especially if it's winter, or to the gym, or deciding on a certain meal or not drinking. But sometimes discipline is the opposite. And that's like not going to the pool or not doing the workout that the coach programmed when you know that you're not quite there on that day.
And I think too, like giving yourself grace, like the majority of folks out there are like, they have family, they have full-time jobs. You're going to miss a workout every once in a while. That's okay. You don't want to miss a ton of workouts, but like something comes up and you're not able to get it in. Like, I would much rather have an athlete not do a workout at like 10 or 11 o'clock at night and like actually get to bed and get some sleep.
Yeah. I mean, you probably have some stories on your end. I mean, you won your first 70.3. When you come in with a talent for a sport and you're making these big gains, you have the early adaptation. I imagine for you, there were some times where you really struggled to put those mindset tools into practice. So I wonder what that evolution looked like, and what you said you're someone who has to be reined in. So what is that process for you, and how do you check in on yourself to make sure that you are keeping things, showing up 10% undercooked and not 1% over? Like, how do you manage that?
I think one of the biggest things for me was having people around me, whether that's training partners or coaches, who are able to help me keep things in perspective. I am really not good at reaching out for help. I am also just like really, really hard on myself. There would be moments where I'd be in the middle of a workout and just like not hitting the numbers that I wanted to be hitting, and start getting like really emotional and really upset, and my nervous system just shooting through the roof. And can't train when you're in that state. It's terrible. So just like having people around me, training partners and coaches, who are able to just like put things in perspective and be like, just do what you can right now. And like, honestly, it took me over a decade to get to that place. So it's not easy. And it's just taken like the consistent work of just doing a little bit better and a little bit better. And I think one of the biggest things that it has brought for me is like, I understand myself so much better of who I am, and I can use those tools outside of sport as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's huge. Alex has this question. It's what are some things you would tell a beginner, that beginner being Alex? So I'm assuming what she means by that is
For the race.
For the race. So I think.
But it's hard because like you went into your first 70.3 and podiumed. So I'm not even sure you're the best person to ask this, but you do have a lot of experience. And the cool thing about triathlon is it's similar to marathons where you get a race with the elites. Like you're in the same field. And so you're racing with amateurs and beginners, and then the beginners are also racing with the elite athletes in the field. So I guess if you could provide any advice to me going into my 70.3, what would it be?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think for you, because I know that you are a longtime athlete, you have a really good understanding of your body and a lot of the mental skills I think that it takes to be an athlete. Like, I think it's really different when someone is very new to athletics. I would definitely give really different advice. So you're talking about for race day. I really think it's easy, just like any race, to get caught up in what's happening around you. The longer the race is, the more it really is about, it's almost like a solo venture. You have to trust your goals for the race and your paces for the race and what you're looking to, because like if you go out too hot in the first like quarter of the bike, you're going to pay for it in the second half of the run. And that's hours later. And so like having the courage and the confidence to be like, no, like this is the heart rate or this is the power that like I'm supposed to target for the bike. For longer distance rate, like for an Ironman, my biggest thing is like the race doesn't start until the second half of the marathon. So having that mindset of like, I've got a long way to go. I need to like make sure that I'm going to get to the finish line strong and not blow my load in the first half of the bike.
Yeah, that's good advice. I'm already mentally prepping because I'm that person that gets really caught up in competition. I'm like pretty good at pacing. I've always been decent at it with CrossFit and running, but I'm like, okay, when you're putting on your socks, actually put your socks on. Don't be like, I don't need socks, because I've never done anything without socks and I've committed to putting socks on. So these are things that I'm like preparing myself for, like, okay, you're going to take the time to put socks on and be disciplined in that way. And similar to getting on the bike, because I don't have a lot of experience with biking. I just started training on my TT bike in shoulder season. So I didn't really get that much time on the bike outside. So I'm going off of numbers from inside. So I'm going to have to really feel how I feel and project and be conservative so that I don't end up having a horrible experience in the run. So that's good advice. And then I guess my question on that is, what would be your advice if it weren't me? Like if it were just a beginner? Because I know a lot of people come into half Ironman and Ironman as novice athletes.
Yeah. I mean, I think for a beginner, like, first of all, I would say in regards to training in general, it's a consistency. Like you just need to be consistent with training. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you just get consistent aerobic work, you're going to be good. I think for someone who's really new to it, and this might be their very first triathlon, I would say that one thing that we sometimes forget about in training is transitions. And it's easy to kind of get flustered in those scenarios. And so have a little like practice session, like go and do a little like T1 practice. Sometimes I would, when I first started triathlon, I would like do like 10 push-ups, set everything up for like the swim to bike transition. And then instead of like actually swimming, I would just do a bunch of push-ups. And then so you're horizontal and then you get vertical and like go and practice your transition. Just doing that 3 times. And you kind of get in your head, okay, get to my bike, put my helmet on, clip it on, put my shoes on, grab my bike, go kind of thing. So you have an idea of what you're going to do instead of getting to your bike and being like, oh my gosh, what am I doing?
Yeah, there's water in my ears. I don't know how to get it out.
Like, it's pretty amazing how just practicing a couple of times, it really gets it in your head and gives you the confidence when you go out there. Yeah, I would say that if it's someone's very first triathlon, that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, Alex is definitely
will do that in the next week.
Transitions.
Yeah, that's good to know.
When timelines for people, I think it's very common to see or hear someone say, like, I did an Ironman once, or I did a half Ironman once. In my opinion, and it's not even just Ironman, you see people bite off these big goals and put these things on their list, and then they want to get it done in like 6 months. And so they do the race because The caps are long. You can go do the race. That's fine. But I think that they make it so hard for themselves, both the training for it and the experience, that it just is completely demotivating and they don't want to do again. So, like, in your opinion, someone who's coming in, maybe not from the couch, but maybe someone's, a 10K runner, a half marathoner, they have years in the gym. What kind of timeline should be in place for someone to do a full Ironman and have an experience that's positive enough where they might want to do a second Ironman?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different factors that go into it, such as like how much time in the week do you have to train and things like that? What are your other stressors in life? I think that, if someone is a unisport athlete, so one sport athlete, and is coming into this and needing to learn how to swim and like learn how to bike, then I do think that having a year to get up to speed in those other sports and then have your like final training block into an Ironman is going to lead you to the most successful potential for longevity. Because it's also like, not only is it, I think one of the major factors that folks have with Ironman training and racing is that like it can wreck relationships and cause a lot of stress in families. It can really overload people. And so it's not just like the athlete themselves who is impacted, but like the whole family. And so if you don't have that support system underneath you, it's going to be really hard to continue in the sport. And so if you are going from like 0 to like training 15 hours a week, that's a huge impact. Whereas if you can just slowly start to ramp things up, your family time adjusts, maybe your partner wants to get involved too, like they see what you're doing and they can start to jump in, or like, you can have those slow adjustments and ramp it up. I think that also creates the potential for longevity in the sport. Though, I mean, to be honest, I think just for the training aspect of it and getting to the finish line, if someone is already a swim bike runner, if they're already doing shorter distances, I think that a like 12 to 16 week program is like going to get you to the finish line. The other thing too is like the longer that you have to like build that base and build that training, the like less cracked and the less like in pain you're going to be at the finish line, and the better experience you're going to have and the more motivation you are going to have to want to do it again.
It's what I call, for a lot of people, a two-hand goal. We kind of have this visual with goals and responsibilities in life. If your training is one ball and your relationship is another and your job's a third, you can realistically kind of only hold two at once. So if you're like really into work and you're really into training, it's probably your relationships and your family that are going to take the hit, or any combination of those things. And so I think a lot of people, when they commit to an Ironman, don't realize that you're committing to kind of like, not only are you going to have to hold this ball, but you're probably going to have to hold it with two hands. And if you're not mentally prepared for that, I think it can have a major impact on your overall happiness. And then sometimes people don't realize that they actually can't fit it in, or they don't want to. And so then there's this internal battle, and maybe they do it and maybe they don't. And they don't even realize why it is that they've bagged this goal. They just feel really bad about themselves for switching to the half Ironman or deferring and then canceling, because it's such a big commitment.
Huge. Yeah, huge.
So I'm doing the half and I'm training quite hard for it. And I have a job that is probably full time if you count all of my hours working, but it's really flexible. Like I can work on Sunday all day if I need to allow for a Tuesday training session or whatever it may be. And I was saying to Meredith, I don't know how people who have full-time jobs, like office jobs, train for full Ironmans, because I didn't get in one of my training sessions this week due to work. And I was like, I feel like it has to be the case where most people who also have a full-time job, it's who can get to the Ironman having done as much training as they can. Yeah. It's just like, how much can you fit in? And then also sleep, because I think a lot of people just cut out sleep, and that's not good for training. You get up at 4:30. Of course, you can work out at 4 a.m. Nothing else is going on, or at 9 p.m. But it's like, what is that doing to your recovery and your well-being?
Everyone's underprepared. It's just a matter of like, how underprepared.
Not everyone, a lot of people.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
A lot of people.
Yeah. And not 10% underprepared, like 40% underprepared.
Well, and that's why you see, especially in the longer distance races, like what are the most competitive age groups? It's like people who are in their 40s and 50s, where like their kids are like grown or maybe out of the house, and they have a little bit more freedom and income to spend on things like that.
Yeah. I've always thought it's like, oh, it's because your muscle fibers change. But I mean, that may also be true.
Well,
but
it's also because most people who are like doing lifting or power sports are like, I'm broken. I have to switch to biking now.
That's, yeah.
And swimming, low impact sports.
But totally like the time and money, because it's it's time consuming, obviously, but also like look at the equipment. I mean, the registration fees are astronomical, and it's like, I don't know what the average cost to show up at a start line is, but
I was going to count up everything that I had to buy for this. And then I thought, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah. I mean, you're easily like, it's 10,000 on the low end.
Yeah. And I got like a very used bike. I was going to ask before we get into the barriers to the sport, if you feel that it's good advice to do a marathon alone, standing on its own before you do an Ironman.
No.
You don't?
No. I haven't done a standalone marathon since Boston in 2005. And I have wanted to do it, but a lot of the coaches that I have been like, no, you're going to break yourself. Because the training that you need to do to run a marathon, and then the marathon itself, the thing with an Ironman marathon is that you're running a marathon, but you're not running at like marathon pace. You're running at like a much easier pace versus if you're running a standalone marathon. Like before I ran Cozumel, I ran a half marathon, a standalone half marathon, and I was way more sore after that standalone half marathon than I was after Ironman Cozumel.
That's insane to hear.
So you did that half marathon in 1:23? Is that?
Yeah.
So what would be your average marathon time or pace for a marathon at the end of an Ironman? 1:23 is probably like a 3:55 per kilometer.
Yeah, 3:55 per kilometer. And I mean, I could say my like ideal Ironman marathon pace, not my like tanking Ironman marathon pace. My ideal pace is like a 4:30 pace.
So pretty significant difference.
Yeah, 4:30 to like 4:45, basically. Yeah. So like almost a minute per kilometer slower.
That would be like an easy, that would be a training pace.
But it isn't after all that biking and swimming.
Yeah.
Okay, that's super interesting. I would have suggested to someone not knowing anything, and no one should ask me, but they should run a marathon before doing an Ironman, just because I think, that's maybe what seems logical, but it's a completely different scenario.
So completely it's different scenario. And also like the risk of injury is just, I think, too great.
Yeah. And then, so going back to the sport and the barriers to it, Meredith did a Olympic distance probably like 6 years ago, 5?
It was like 2021. Yeah.
Okay. So 3 years ago, she rented a bike. She had to buy a tri-suit. I think you borrowed a wetsuit. Or no, there was no swim.
Ended up having to cancel the swim. It was sad for me.
Due to, I think, like algae or something.
It's Alberta. So it's like a 50-50 shot on whether the swim ever happens in those lakes.
Yeah. So anyways, and then we get there and I'm looking at these bikes and Meredith's telling me how much they are. And I'm like, I can never do a triathlon. We're too poor. It was like the amount of money even that Meredith had to spend just to do it. And she was like renting a bike and stuff. And so then, I was telling Catherine, the woman who runs Feisty or is part of Feisty, she was like, oh, if you really like running, and because I was like, I don't really like trail running because I'm really into my paces and times and data and that sort of thing. She's like, you'd really like triathlon. So that's when I kind of started thinking like, maybe I'll do that. And now that we are a little bit better off with our business, it's a little bit more manageable, but still a lot. I do think that cost is a pretty huge barrier to the sport. And then, of course, as we talk time. Like what else pops up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the financial side of things, you don't need to spend a huge amount, especially if you're doing shorter distance races. People talk about like all of the aero stuff and getting the special tri-suits and everything. To be honest, you don't necessarily need to like get all the fanciest, fastest, most expensive stuff. There are definitely ways to do it on the cheap. If you're not looking for performance, you're just looking to like have a fun hobby. Other barriers to the sport, well, I think it depends on your gender, your race, your size. There are a lot of different of those intersectional identities that it's challenging, even just like the comfort level in the races, but also finding equipment that fits you, finding a triathlon suit or bike gear or run gear that fits you, the swim caps that you have to wear fitting over your head, fitting over your hair. For some people, it's physically impossible for them to like find equipment or be able to participate in the races. So, I mean, I think that's a huge barrier that is on the shoulders of triathlon. It's on the shoulders of race directors and the sport to address and fix, and to the industry. The number of clothing companies out there who don't fit larger bodies. It's like, what are you supposed to wear?
Well,
Yeah.
especially European companies. I'm like, okay, so I'm an extra large. Like, what are
Yeah.
people who are bigger bodied wearing?
Yeah, totally.
We went into a bike shop the other day and I was like, I put on a size like 14 and I was like, what is going on? It's nothing wrong with size 14, but I'm not that size. I'm usually like a 6. And the woman was like, yeah, we're going to stop carrying this brand because it's this European brand where the sizing is all messed up and people come out of the dressing rooms crying.
Yeah, it's terrible.
It's awful. Do you see, I guess I'm a little more privy to the cycling gravel scene, and you do see a lot of work being done by race directors and people in that space to make it more inclusive, gender, minorities, like those intersections of identity are being taken care of, or at least there's steps. Do you see Ironman doing that? I mean, it's a big ask, especially cycling, which is such a men's space traditionally, and it's been around for a long time. Like, what do you see Ironman and triathlon race directors doing? Do you see them doing the same kind of work, I guess?
Yes and no. So I think things are a lot different at the grassroots level. Back in 2021, one of the triathlon race series included a non-binary category. And there are some really great initiatives in the US of like women's races, like getting more women into triathlon. I do know Ironman does have the Women for Tri stuff. And so that's encouraging more women to get in the sport. And I think we have seen a change for sure in the dynamics. It's super different over in Europe. You still see a much smaller women's field. I don't know much about non-binary initiatives over in other parts of the world other than North America either. Ironman is terrible with trans and non-binary inclusion, barely thinking about it. I heard a story about, I think it was at Ironman Cozumel, some of the racers who are disabled, who are in the PC categories or who require assistance. So like blind athletes or like athletes that need help getting from the water to the bike kind of thing. Ironman they're like, no, we're not going to provide that service. So there's no space for those folks to come and race at our race.
Wow.
And it's just like, really? Wow.
Is that just like it's just a big organization and they can't be bothered? Or is it like a leadership problem?
And I think it's probably a mixture of both. Because you see, USAT, even now in amateur racing, short distance racing, has a non-binary category for national championships. You don't see that in World Triathlon. You don't see that at Ironman World Championships. The third open category for Ironman, there's no podium. There's no awards even. There's zero recognition of it. And so it's you do see that imbalance there of I think very much it was the leadership at USAT that brought in that initiative. Whereas with Ironman, there's been, since I started in triathlon, there was the 50 Women to Kona of trying to get even just professional gender parity in Ironman World Championships. I just don't think that they're interested. They're a giant corporation kind of just focused on making money.
Yeah.
So how, as somebody who identifies as non-binary, how is it for you to compete in Ironman sport as having to basically enter in as your biological sex and not have that?
Yeah. Up until more recently, it's just been so normal. My coming out journey was during the time when I was a professional athlete and racing in the women's field and hadn't yet raced as a non-binary athlete. It made me feel better when I knew why I felt like a weirdo standing at the start line of why I felt different and not kind of like an imposter in a certain way. And so I've just kind of come to terms with that of yes, this is the only category that is available to me to make money in this sport and to race professionally. But once I started doing more gravel and, the experience of being on the podium, the first non-binary podium, especially the first completely full non-binary podium at Unbound in 2022 was a really profound experience for me and was so this is how it's supposed to feel. And so now with that juxtaposition coming back into the world of triathlon, it's really, I feel a lot more jaded and a lot more sensitive, I think, to it. And so it is actually quite motivating for me to start working more towards change in that sport. It was really cool. Ironman Florida last year, it was the first time in triathlon in the racing that I had done where there was another non-binary athlete racing in the professional field. That was so cool. It was so, so cool. And so it's experiences like that are really motivating because it's like, okay, like I'm not just the only one. Like, okay, now there's two of us. You see change. And then especially you see in the gravel community of like, if you create the category and it is growing exponentially, like it's nuts. It's so, so cool. I now am like a lot more motivated to do a bit more advocacy work in the triathlon space to try and create that and having more self-confidence in that and finding a voice more and more because it's scary to be out. It takes a lot of energy, especially in the current political environment that we have now, particularly in the US and particularly after having top surgery and feeling just like a little bit more like visibly non-binary. There's a little bit more anxiety, I think, moving through the world, not because of like how I feel about myself, but because of the external stuff.
You can almost have such a strong belief in yourself and you can uphold your own identity in different ways that you don't necessarily need structures to do that. But I think it's different when you're seeing structures upheld in certain communities and organizations that are now it's going in the direction of invalidating someone's experience and identity. And so that's the way I see it. And you certainly feel that now. And it's different than it was 10 years ago. But I think, like you said, to go back to the grassroots and change happening at that level, like that's where the change has always come from. I mean, you can never look at corporations to do the right thing. They're just not going to. But you make enough of a fuss locally and you start getting smaller races to add categories and advocate. And you see people fill those categories. And it's like, these people didn't come from nowhere. Like they've been here all along. They just needed a space to be. And you get races like Unbound. You have Rebecca's, that race is just ridiculously inclusive for how hard it is. And that's how you start to affect change at the Ironman level, but it takes time. And like, it's definitely not linear. Maybe it was moving in a direction and now with a lot of things has gone backwards. And that doesn't mean the work is over. It just means that, okay, we took a few steps back. Now we keep working, to get back where we were and then work harder to move forward in that regard.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like any progression. It's never linear. It's all over the map. It's a roller coaster, but, I do think that we are trending in the right direction. It was actually really interesting thinking about this now being in Mexico, where things are a little bit different. That the race down in Cozumel is independently run by the folks down there. And so things are done a little bit differently than they are in North America. And so even to see that, because it's like I see now like how triathlon has moved forward in North America versus in other places of like, you notice some of those like things that are still like a step backwards. You're like, oh, like, gendered porta potties.
You're like, but why? It has a door. Didn't we all fly here on an airplane? You use non-gendered bathrooms on the way here, but now all of a sudden porta potties are problematic. Got it.
Totally.
Cool.
Yeah.
So kind of on that topic a little bit, the recent post from a couple of weeks ago on you reflecting while you're in Mexico on your identity and how you feel in different environments, specifically related to your top surgery and swimming and how to kind of navigate that space and how you feel the most comfortable with yourself now because how you look aligns more with your identity, but how you can still end up in environments where you're feeling, I guess the word, I'm not sure exactly what you said, but it was like an unsure feeling. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how you navigate it? Like, do you wear certain types of bathing suits in different areas for specific reasons? And then in that, like, how has your identity evolved? And have you ever felt like you've identified in some way that didn't feel right? You kind of mentioned that a little bit when you were talking about being in the women's field. How you were like, now I know why I feel different. I ask very big questions. So I'll leave it to you to kind of like
answer what you want,
parse that apart and take what you want and leave what you don't.
Repeat things.
Yeah. I mean, I want to caveat all of this. Like, of course, this is my own personal experience. I think everyone has their own different experience, their own different comfort levels. Like some folks, they have top surgery or just feel much differently in their bodies and are way more comfortable and are just like right off the bat, just like, I've had surgery, now I'm great. And like everywhere that I go, I'm going to be topless and like, this is me. And it's been a really different experience for me. And it may be because, to be honest, I think a lot of us feel that we're being observed more than we actually are, and that people care more than they actually do. That's probably for sure goes into things for me. But it is an interesting experience going from, even after surgery, it took me over a year to be comfortable being out in public without a top on. And initially I was like, well, I just don't know if that's me. Maybe that's just not how I want to express my gender or like move through the world. And so it's really been an evolution for me. But a lot of it, I think in retrospect, was around just the possibility of confrontation, the possibility of, particularly in the US and in other countries, I think, of violence or of confrontation, which is really scary. And I think that's why in certain scenarios, depending on where I am and who I'm with, and even just my own energy and confidence levels, I may choose to wear a one-piece bathing suit or cover up top to feel more comfortable and to not have the potential of that, and just like, okay, I don't have to deal with getting looked at or thinking I'm being looked at or whatever. My experience though here in Vancouver and in like the kind of regular places that I show up, like at the pools, for example, has been a really interesting experience, because I think initially I was really worried about how some of those regular people that I see every day who don't really know me that well, but still, whatever, regulars at the pool. I'm like, oh, how are they going to, which is kind of like crazy. Like these are random strangers who I'm like acquainted with. It's like, why do I care what this 70-year-old man is going to think of me? But I don't know. That was just me and my experience. And so it was actually really cool when I did start in my own safe little bubble here to come out and be more sort of out and visible and topless, both outdoors and then indoors at the pool, that it wasn't a big deal. Like either people didn't even say anything and it was just normal, or they were like, it's really cool to see you like out and like congratulations and things like that, and really positive. Sure, maybe like what I'm not privy to, there's been like some talk or negative stuff, but I'm not privy to that and I'm happy to be ignorant to it.
Yeah. I mean, people who are going to do that are going to do that for a lot of different reasons. Even if you didn't have top surgery or you weren't shirtless, it would be about you. It would be about someone else. It's just people who talk are going to talk. And that says more about them than you.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that just knowing that in these spaces, like I know a lot of people, I know I have allies, I know the lifeguards really well. If anything happens in the change rooms or if anything happens in the pool, like I have people there who are going to stick up for me and are not going to let anything happen. So yeah, that was really helpful.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about Unbound quickly?
Yeah, I mean,
think before we let you go, I definitely want to ask you a couple nutrition questions. Not necessarily for me, although I'm sure I'll gain some knowledge based on what you do. I did read your recent post about what you did, so I'll ask some questions about that. But Meredith's doing Unbound 200 for the first time. She did 100 last year.
How many years have you done Unbound?
This will be my 4th year in a row coming up.
The 200 distance has been your distance?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah. I can't remember what year Lifetime bought that race, but it seemed to have gotten really, really big in the last 2 years because of probably the series. Kansas is kind of a weird place. Emporia. I grew up in the Southeast. I grew up in North Carolina. So Southern culture is not unusual for me, but I had some concerns as a gay person going to Emporia. I was just like, I'm going to go. I'm not sure how I'm going to be, but it was actually awesome. I think it's just because the cycling community kind of picks up and relocates and is just great. Have you seen it change, become more inclusive? Like, what's the vibe been or the evolution of it been since you've been going?
That's a great question. I think I'm really curious to see where it's going to go in the next couple of years. Right after the pandemic, there was this sort of push in like 2021, 2022, 2023 to like bring in like really amplify non-binary voices and trans athletes and just like, kind of bring them into the fold and encourage participation and competition. And there is also at the same time now especially last year, more of a concentration on like the women's professional field and like bringing parity into that, which of course, super valid. It was amazing this year to see like for the women to have their own, professional women to have their own start, have their own race, totally different dynamic, 9-up sprint finish, like very, very cool racing and opportunities. And it just meant that like there was less of a focus on the non-binary side of things. There's also, I think, some of that like financial support has dropped out, or just like that momentum of like, it's expensive to get to these races. They're not in the most accessible parts of the country. And so it's hard to expect the folks to like continue to show up. And I think that's what's starting to happen is that for some of these non-binary athletes, they just can't keep showing up at these and not have any support. And so, I mean, now we're having growth. We're seeing new and different faces, which is really exciting. But it does feel like there's a bit of a transition of like, there was first this like wave of trans and non-binary athletes, and now we're seeing like another wave. So I'm really curious to see like what's going to happen in the next few years, and hoping that we're able to continue that momentum. And I absolutely think like the visibility of all of the trans and non-binary athletes that are showing up now, it's like so cool and so inspiring, and that we are seeing just more and more people coming. So again, it almost feels like it's the 2 steps forward, 1 half a step back.
Yeah. I mean, it is because, you make such a good point with the women's professional bringing up representation and prize money and coverage and things like that. There's a lot of value in doing that. But like you said, and I hadn't even thought about it until you said it, it impacts the other categories negatively. Like it does take money away. It does take attention away. And so it's, the men's professional field's always been kind of a pillar in the sport. You'll see the same faces there. Women, now they are becoming a pillar in the sport. So you'll see the same faces, and like, that's great for them. But it's really telling to hear you say, yeah, there's turnover in non-binary and trans representation. Like, yes, there are athletes still coming. They're not the same athletes. And that is a really important point, really telling, especially, a race like Unbound, because it is hard to get to. It's hard to even figure out where to stay. It's expensive. Airbnbs are jacked up in price, like just through the roof. You have to know people and know how to navigate that ecosystem to even be able to do it. And that's really interesting. For me, it's, I'm involved with Feisty and Girls Gone Gravel, and we're doing this women's initiative. And I always like grapple with that a little bit because, I do want more recreational and high-level amateur women in the sport. I want to work to remove those barriers, but at the same time, we can't expect women to do the representation for all groups. In fact, what we see is women actually do a really poor job of that. And they often reinforce racism, sexism, really binary ways of living. And it's not, sometimes it's active, sometimes it's just what happens when you participate in a racist and sexist and misogynist patriarchal society, and it's unfortunate. So I grapple with this like, okay, I'm doing this initiative, but I also am a queer person, and I know that my other people are misrepresented and I'm not advocating for them. So I have a bit of an internal battle going with that, but I'm going to do the women's work for the next 2 years and, hopefully work in some other spaces for queer folks as well.
Yeah. And I mean, that being said, like at Mid-South this year or in next year, 2025, for the first time ever in any sport that I've ever heard of, they're having a professional non-binary category. Like, incredible. When I saw that, and like, I had no idea, like, they didn't tell me about this. Somebody else sent it to me, and I was just like, what? This is so cool. And like, to know that is happening because we have been showing up, because the level of competition is getting stiffer and stiffer. It's very, very cool to see that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. As far as Unbound goes, I want your opinion on the race itself. I went into it, and granted, I only did the 100-mile last year, but I trained for it. I watched all the YouTube videos. I read all the things. I was obsessing over tires. I was like, okay, well, the North Course is this, and all you hear is how hard it is. And I raced it, and I was like, I mean, I don't want to call that easy, but that was as ideal gravel conditions as I have ever been on. And I think part of it, we live in Fernie, like the gravel around here is just gnarly. It was dry, and I know that matters, but I didn't really find it that challenging. Even people were like, well, the elevation really accumulates. And I was like, I didn't really perceive a lot of elevation. I didn't actually find it that hard, other than that it's just hard to ride hard for 100 miles.
Yeah. I would say, coming from where we come from, the elevation of Kansas is very different than what we are used to. It is kind of like, yes, it is rolling. You're tired at the end and there are hills, but it's fine. Last year was such a fast year. It was such ideal conditions. It wasn't crazy hot. There was not a huge amount of mud. It was so fast. Yeah. So skewed.
I was like, you didn't even need to use your spatula.
I was like, I brought it and everything. I think I ditched it at halfway. I like tossed off a bag I didn't need. And I was like, this course is fast. And I just like left.
Yeah.
The 200 is double the distance. So even in the exact same conditions, it's kind of a different thing. But yeah, I finished and I was like, man, I would challenge anyone to come up and race the Fernie race. This year in Fernie was 30 plus degrees. There's so much elevation. You're on single track. I was like, you guys need to come up to Canada. I'm just saying, even Alberta gravel roads, I'm like, you need to come ride up here. It's wild. I did an Alberta ride just outside of Calgary and it was so windy that it was just blowing me across the road. I was like, oh my God. I was like, I actually can't prevent myself from just being blown off the road right now. It's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you're doing the 200 again this year.
I'm doing the 200 again this year, 2025. Always carry your mud stick. Of course, there are the stories of people like having to walk like literally hours through mud. Even the year before last, when I think at mile like 16 or something, we had a long chunk of mud and everybody was complaining because I was really grateful my bike didn't break. And so maybe I would be saying something differently if the mud broke my bike at mile 16. But I was like, whatever, that's unbound. You got to deal with it. But it's true. And then, yeah, having that. And then the first year that I did it, we had mud in the latter half, but also like it was like super hot. And then all of a sudden this crazy storm came in and it was lightning and like pelting rain. And I was actually terrified riding. And I was like, I'm going to die. I'm going to get hit by lightning. This is insane. And then of course it clears up. So that's the thing, like in 12 hours or 20 hours, depending on how long it's going to take you. And so much can happen in that time. And like storms come through, the mud is real.
I'm banking on a 12-hour experience. If it's 20, something's gone really sideways.
If it's 20, you're really going to owe me for being your support.
Kidding. Kansas gets really big weather. And it's just crazy. There's so many people out there that experience that too. It's not like, oh, I got stuck in the weather on my little group ride. No, it's like 5,000 people that are out on the course. They're like, good luck. Don't forget your paint stick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I could ask so many questions. I feel like we're going to have you back on the podcast because I learned a lot more about you before this podcast, which I'll talk about in the intro. But I did want to ask before we let you go about your nutrition. And I read on the bike, you took in, this was in Cozumel, you took in 4,500 milligrams of electrolytes, 2 Morton bars, 3 gels, 1 keto NEIQ. I don't know what that is, but you were basically taking in 400 calories an hour, which is 100 grams carbs, which is on the higher end. Studies have shown that we can utilize that many carbs. I think before the science was kind of saying, 60 to 90, and now they're saying you could push up to 120 grams of carbs. I mean, what does your nutrition look like? Is that kind of typical for what you take in for the races? And then how has your nutrition evolved in that way too? It takes a lot of practice and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Lots and lots of practice. Yeah. I mean, my evolution with half Ironmans, it's like always I just nailed my nutrition right off the bat. Or like, what I was doing just like worked right off the bat. And so it's like, I've got that dialed. I have no problems with that. And it's really approximately the same. It's like a little bit less per hour. But yeah, on the bike now, I try and target about 400 calories an hour. I'm still evolving my nutrition and obviously it's not working. So it's
a work in progress.
It's a work in progress, or it like works some days and not others. But yeah, somewhere between like 350 to 400 calories an hour on the bike. And that's just like making sure that I am topped up for the run. Because on the run, I would really like to be able to take in more than I am. I'm taking in somewhere between 200 to 240 calories an hour on the run. And that's just because I can't seem to increase that without a lot more GI distress. The salt, I did a sweat test with the precision hydration. So I know that I am going through about just under 1,000 milligrams per liter in my sweat. So I try and take in around that per hour. It's okay to be a little bit under, at least for me. And then I'm still experimenting in the longer distance races. I don't need to do this in 70.3s of using not only carbs, but also including a little bit of protein and fat on the bike. And that's why I added in those Morton bars, because they've got a little bit in there. And I believe that it sort of titrates out the carbohydrates a little bit, so I'm not burning them up as quickly. And then the ketone IQ, that's a ketone ester. I've just been experimenting with it a little bit in my Ironman racing. It is supposed to basically be an alternate fuel source to carbohydrate and is supposed to be like a nootropic. So like helping with mental fatigue and that sort of thing. I don't know if it's working for me. It definitely works for recovery for me. Recovery is awesome. I used that when I raced Trans Rockies Gravel Royale 2 years ago after every stage, and it was money. Like I ended up winning every stage of that race and like finishing really strong. So I like swear by that.
Do you think that's more the nootropic, like the brain effect for recovery?
I think that it has, and I may totally be getting the science wrong, feel like I'm more of like I just like barrel through life and I'm not like a super detail oriented, like I'm taking this thing because it, helps my body absorb carbohydrates more efficiently. But no, I think that's what it does. I think it helps the body absorb carbohydrates a little bit better. It helps your glycogen stores reboost more quickly.
I almost think there's more value in going that route and just doing things and going through the experience and being like, yes, this was positive. This felt good. I think this worked. And like not worrying so much about the science, because then you kind of start to believe that things should work. So you're like, yes, this works because you want it to work versus like, no, this just works for me. So I do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like placebo is massive. Who cares if it's actually doing something or not? If you believe it is and your body's reacting to it like that, then whatever.
It's like Space Jam. It's like that bottle, like Michael's secret stuff.
Well, there's a whole study now.
I'm never referencing Space Jam.
Great one.
There's a whole study now that basically says that sodium supplementation isn't necessary. And as somebody who is also a salty sweater and loses a ton of salt because I can see it on my face when I run, for a marathon, I take in 4,500 milligrams like throughout the marathon. So that's like 1,500 an hour. And then the study comes out that basically states you don't have to. And I'm like, I'm not stopping.
Well, okay, that gets an asterisk.
Yeah, okay.
The study basically, it says like below 5 hours, definitely, like you probably don't need any sodium. Especially, I mean, and the science has been out, you don't need to replace it to 100% ever. So even if, you're losing 1,000 milligrams per liter, you could replace that at 50% and be fine. There's like a lot of things that sodium probably does do, like helps with carbohydrate and glycogen mechanics and all of those things that would be still relevant. But anything over 5 hours, they're like, that is where there may be a benefit. And they've looked at renal markers in ultra endurance athletes. And I mean, this study was like really, really well performed. Because basically, I think the concern was...
I was like, the sample size is too small.
And I was like, no, Alex, the study is immaculate. It's 9 people, but it only needs to be 9 people. The concern is that if you consume too much sodium, there may be a compulsory increase in thirst. And so then you have people over consuming fluids and that creates all kinds of issues. So they went in with this hypothesis that, of what they were going to see and then basically didn't see any of that. And this is like the salt researcher. This is the guy. And so he created a model and then in his first study, and that was, I think, 2022. And then 2023 did this really, really well-controlled lab study, very experienced ultra endurance athletes doing, I think it was like 5 to 8 hours on a treadmill, like rectal thermometers. I mean, this thing is...
So I'm like, that sounds awful to begin with.
I mean, who would sign up for
Then
that?
you add the rectal thermometer.
But yeah, the findings are really interesting. And what it means is that what we think we know about sodium is not accurate. It probably is doing some other things, but replacing it in high quantities for shorter events, definitely not as necessary as we once thought. For Ironman, probably still necessary.
But for like marathons, it's like they're basically saying not necessary.
Yeah, I think, depends. But yeah, it's true. It's like if you believe it's working and it's not causing any negative effects, then like, why not?
And if you're craving salt, like in an event, you probably need some.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think that kind of direction can also get a bit dangerous just in terms of like the hyponatremia side of things, because you can die from that. People have died in marathon, like because some people are taking 5 or 6 hours or 8 hours to run a marathon. I know 2 people who at Unbound have gotten hyponatremia and ended up in the hospital. So it's definitely a thing for longer distance stuff that you don't want to forget about.
Yeah. My last question is from just an overall nutrition model. How do you eat? We come from CrossFit, so tracking is like a big thing, or at least was. I know it's not as big in other sports, like tracking your macros, counting calories, making sure you're eating enough. How do you do that? And then is your nutrition periodized at all? So within that question, do you take off seasons where you're like less dialed in?
That's a really great question. I've had such an evolution in my nutrition outside of training, outside of workouts. My nutrition now is so much geared around my running and my gut. For me, I went through a whole period of doing like the low FODMAP stuff to try and deal with that. So it's like, I know that I have certain sugar, vegetables, and fruits that I stay away from. My diet is not super dialed other than limiting those and limiting fat, which I found was the other trigger for my gut. I feel like I'm on what I would consider a super low fat diet, which I think is probably just like normal fat diet for the rest of the population. But I had gotten so used to eating so much fat because it was like I could eat whatever I want. I could eat a ton of fat and like my body composition, I would still be losing weight in an Ironman build. So I'm like, it kind of felt like I could just eat whatever I wanted. And now I eat a lot of food. I eat kind of all the time. My meals are super basic without a whole lot of spices and fats. I'm not counting macros. I'm just like trying to pay most attention to like a lower fat and a higher protein, like trying to get in enough protein. I'm pescatarian, so I'm having to like supplement with a protein powder at least once a day to get in enough protein. I eat a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of starch. And then when for off season or like right after races, I just eat whatever I want. I eat high fat things. I eat all the naughty vegetables that I'm not supposed to eat.
Do you like notice a change in your GI symptoms when your training volume and intensity is a little bit lower?
I think that I do. I think that when things are lower volume, that I have less issues.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a few people in our world who experience that. And it seems like when they go on vacation or they do a little bit less training, easier training, a lot of the GI issues that they live with somewhat constantly kind of just go away.
Yeah. And I think that part of that is nervous system related too. And I've really wanted to try this of just really focusing on calming my nervous system. So like doing daily meditation, doing some sort of like daily non-sleep deep rest kind of something to really downregulate my nervous system and see how that affects my gut symptoms, because I do think that they are also super related. And of course, with high training, you're just like causing a lot of stress in the body. And so it's going to react in a different way.
Yeah, there's some interesting research on box breathing specifically, but it's like controlled studies on people who have GERD and reflux disorder, and doing breathing exercises like 2 or 3 times a day has a dramatic effect on symptoms that they experience. So I think there's definitely something to that. If you do that, let's circle back and talk about it.
Yeah, I'm so terrible at this. I've for years wanted like a regular meditation practice, but I have ADHD and it's really hard. Really hard to be consistent. I need to figure out some sort of accountability buddy who's going to like help me.
My ADHD means that I do a lot of research on what the best kind of meditation is, and then I never start it. But I know a lot about it.
I ruminate. So anytime I'm sitting still without anything coming at me, it just like gets worse. So I need to be in motion with some sort of, something going on. Well, we're in it together.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, we won't take any more of your time. It was so awesome talking to you. Like I said, I have so many more questions that I'll save for another time, but I really appreciated you spending the time answering our questions and just being so open and honest and forthcoming. And I just think you're a really, really cool person. And I appreciated this so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, yeah, seriously, I could keep talking about all this stuff for hours, but I really appreciate the time and the invite.
If people wanted to find you and keep up with what you're doing, where's the best place?
Best place is Instagram for sure, at Rachel McBee, Rachel MCB. Yeah, that's a great place to find me. I have a website. It's really in need of updating. But in general, that's like where my race schedule is going to be.
Yeah, well, thanks again for chatting with us today. And we'll be sure to keep up with what you're doing and maybe have you back on for a follow-up.
Absolutely. I would love that.
Perfect.